Okay, well, good evening, everyone, and welcome back to our study of John's Gospel. After a week off for illness, we're going to be resuming where we left off 2 weeks ago with John chapter 10, verse 1. 2 weeks ago, we set up the whole issue in John chapter 10, and now this week we want to actually begin our discussion of the verses. There is a new lesson available for tonight that covers verses 7 to 18, and I do expect that we would get into that. But we're going to begin with the lesson that was posted 2 weeks ago that covers verses 1 through 6. So let's begin our study of the Word with prayers. We pray. Lord Jesus Christ, we give you our thanks and praise that you have revealed yourself to us and have come to make the Father known. You are the good shepherd who laid down your life for us, only to take it up again, that we might have life and have it to the full. We ask that you would open our eyes to see wonderful things in your holy word, that we may be built up in our faith, and that we may increase in our confidence that you are our good shepherd. We ask this in your holy name. Amen. Okay, so as we mentioned 2 weeks ago, this John chapter 10 is known as the Good Shepherd chapter of the Bible, and perhaps that's not really right because of all of the Old Testament shepherd imagery that is used throughout the Bible, whether it's actual shepherds, people like Moses or Abel or David, or whether it's God's Old Testament people who are functioning like shepherds, or whether it's the latter prophets using the concept of shepherds to describe the Lord's care for his people, something like Psalm 23. So this is a very rich Old Testament picture, this shepherd-sheep relationship. And Jesus is going to use it, and he's going to manipulate it in a whole bunch of different ways in John chapter 10. It begins, though, the chapter begins verses 1 through 5 with what, if you just look at verse 6 really quickly, it says, Jesus used this figure of speech. That's a unique word. It's a word that isn't used anywhere else in the New Testament. And it's not the word parable, which is the more common word for a figure of speech that's used in the Gospels. Jesus very often speaks in parables. But the word that's used there is a virtual synonym for a parable. And it really covers a whole range of different kind of literary devices that a person could use. So I've called this lesson the figure of speech. Okay, so whether you want to call it a parable or a story or a shepherd narrative or something like that, it's a way of speaking. It's a figure of speech. And Jesus is going to be introducing a whole bunch of ideas that would have been very common to the people of his day, maybe not so common to ours. And then in the next section, verses 7 to 18, he's going to play with those images. He's going to manipulate them for his own purposes. So there is a lot of teaching in these first 5 verses, but it's also done in such a way as to kind of introduce us to ideas and themes that are going to appear throughout the chapter. So let's just start with verse 1. This is John 10, verse 1. It says, "Very truly, I tell you, Pharisees, anyone who does not enter the sheep pen by the gate, but climbs in by some other way, is a thief and a robber." There are a few things that we got to say before we launch too far into this. And the first is that you'll notice that the chapter begins with the oath statement. Very truly I say to you, or if you're of a former generation, verily, verily I say unto thee. And this isn't the first time that we've seen this in the Gospels. In fact, in John's Gospel, in fact, we've seen it several times already. And we always have pointed out that when Jesus takes that oath, when he says, verily, verily, I say unto you, or very truly I say to you, or truly I say to you, whatever translation you have, he's taking an oath. He's swearing about the truthfulness of what he's saying, not because Jesus has to swear, because everything that Jesus says is true. Jesus is the truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me. But because there's usually some kind of shock value behind what he's about to say. And he's taking an oath to kind of get people's attention and to testify to or bring emphasis to the impact of the words that he's speaking. Now, so it's always a good idea. Whenever you hear Jesus use the oath formula, it's always kind of a sign that your ears should perk up. Whatever he says next is going to be important. And it's probably going to be shocking. In fact, kind of my own rule of thumb for my own personal reading is that if Jesus says, very truly I say to you, and then what comes out of his mouth next doesn't shock me, then the chances are I've misunderstood what he said next. Because he doesn't take oaths in vain. He doesn't take oaths for nothing. But the other interesting thing to point out here about in John's gospel is that this oath formula that Jesus uses is never used at the beginning of a discourse. It's always used later on in discourses after a point has been made. In other words, the oath formula is invoked by Jesus not to start a conversation, but to continue a conversation or to explain something that he's already said. Now, the reason that we bring this up is because we have a difficult time as English readers when we see that big number 10 at the left side of verse 1. You see, this is a new chapter of John, and perhaps we're tempted to think this is a whole new section. But there are multiple reasons not to think that. There are multiple reasons not to separate John 9 and 10 from each other. First of all, remember that usually when new sections begin, we get some kind of temporal marker from John. Just to give you an example, at the beginning of John chapter 9, we have, as he went along, he saw a man blind from birth. If you go back to chapter 7, we get an after this, Jesus went around to Galilee. So there's some kind of, John has the tendency when he introduces a new section to give us some kind of temporal or narrative marker that a new section has begun. There is no such marker at the beginning of John chapter 10. He's just talking. And so I really think, and I'm not the only one, lots of commentators believe, that really what Jesus is saying here is a continuation of what he had said at verse 9, at the end of chapter 9. And he was talking about how he has come so that the blind can see and those who can see will be blind. Okay, so that's kind of piece of evidence number one that there isn't a big break between 9 and 10 is the lack of any kind of narrative or temporal marker. The second reason is that notice who this little parable, this little figure of speech is directed to. He says, very truly I tell you, Pharisees. Okay, so this isn't a new section where all of a sudden Jesus is talking to his disciples or something like that. Remember, he had said at the end of chapter 9, he had said that the reason I came was so the blind could see and those who could see would be blind. And the Pharisees stand up and say, what, are you saying that we're blind? And this is Jesus' response to what the Pharisees are objecting to his statement at the end of chapter 9. And then finally, probably the biggest reason that we would see chapter 10 as really belonging to chapter 9. To see it, you got to go all the way down to chapter 10, verse 21. And as we have seen throughout John's gospel, and we're going to continue to see it whenever Jesus teaches, people are divided. And you'll notice that in verse 21, some of the people argue, can a demon open the eyes of the blind? And that is obviously a reference to what we read in John chapter 9. So I would suggest to you that the guy who divided up the John into chapters had a bad day when he started John 10 here. He really should have started John 10 at what we call John 10:22. Because John 10:1 to 21 really all belongs to the end of chapter 9. It's really all a continuation of the light blindness discussion. It's just that same discussion with different metaphorical terms being used. Now we're talking about sheep and shepherds. Okay, so it's just a reminder. Don't let the English chapterization and versification create barriers where they needn't be. Okay. The other thing we want to say about these verses before we actually get into what they mean is just a reminder that this is a setting that would have been common in Jesus' day, even though it's very uncommon in ours. Sheep are the most commonly mentioned animal in the Bible, and sheep were, in a lot of ways, were the backbone of Israel's economy. Not only for their textile, obviously for their textiles, for their milk, for their meat, but then maybe most importantly, because of the role that they played in Israel's sacrificial system, the special place that they play as sacrificial animals and getting right with God. So probably what's envisioned here, we do know that there are some wealthy first century Palestinian families. If you are very wealthy and had your own flock of sheep, a very large flock of sheep, that maybe you had your own sheep pen. But that was more the exception than the rule. What was much more common is that every family, or maybe groups of families, would have flocks, and they would all stay in one pen together overnight. There would be kind of a community sheep pen. And all the shepherds in the village would keep their sheep in that one pen overnight. And of course, there are several advantages to this. Let's just say you've got 10 families in the village who all put their sheep in one pen at night, and then each of them contribute 1/10 of the cost of someone to watch over those sheep at night. So instead of 10 different families having to pay a full salary for a shepherd to watch over the flock at night, they put them all in one pen, and then they all contribute to the price of that one, the cost of that one overseer, the hired hand. The problem that you have then, of course, is that the sheep get all mixed up. Okay, the sheep they're not humans. They don't have cliques. Okay, they don't only hang out with their own fellow sheep. They don't really know who belongs to whom. So they get all mixed up. So what would have happened, and this still happens today actually in Palestine, is that at the beginning of the day, the various shepherds would go to the gate of the sheep pen, and they would each have their own unique call. They make their own little sound. Everybody's would be a little different. And the sheep recognized both the voice of their shepherd and the special sound that their shepherd made. And this is how they sorted the sheep every morning, is that every shepherd would make their own sound, and then their sheep, which had intermingled throughout the night, would come out to their shepherd. But they wouldn't go to a shepherd they didn't know. They wouldn't go to a shepherd whose voice and call they didn't recognize. It worked pretty well. And this is the picture that Jesus is drawing on in these first 6 verses. This communal sheep pen watched over at night by one hired hand, where you have multiple flocks who are intermingling together and who are sorted at the end of the night by the voice of their respective shepherds. Okay? So, with that being said, we're now actually kind of ready to read, to talk about the gate, or about the meaning of the verse. And what we're going to say about the meaning of the verse, what is really emphasized here in verse 1, is that there are 2 different kinds of people that will come after sheep, that will come looking for sheep. The authorized person and the unauthorized person. Now, if you're the authorized person and you're coming to collect your sheep, you go to the gate. You go to the place where everybody goes to come collect the sheep. And the hired hand who watches over the sheep at night recognizes you as the authorized shepherd, as the person who has the right to claim their sheep. If you are an unauthorized person, you don't go to the gate the guard would be, you kind of climb in over the wall or over the fence. You look for a secret way in because you're not authorized to get access to the sheep. Now, in this little parable, Jesus is obviously the shepherd, and he's going to make that explicitly clear in a couple of different ways later in John chapter 10. But the part that makes the verily, verily, the reason that this section begins with a oath statement is because Jesus is saying something very unflattering about the Pharisees. Remember, the Pharisees, as the leaders of God's people, very much like Moses and David, would have viewed themselves as the shepherds of God's people, as the shepherds of the flock of the people of God. And Jesus steps up and he says to those Pharisees, actually, you are robbers and thieves. You are not in the tradition of Moses and David. You're in the tradition of the evil shepherds described in Jeremiah and Isaiah and Zechariah. I am the good shepherd. You are the robbers and the thieves. I access the sheep in an authorized way. The Father has authorized me to do that. You are fleecing the sheep. I have come to give them life by giving up my life. You have come to get your life at the cost of theirs. And this is why it requires an oath statement. Jesus is really leveling a charge against the Pharisees. He is really calling them out as unfaithful shepherds who are not, because they're not going through the gate, they're not going through the authorized entry point. They show themselves to be less interested in the good of the sheep and more interested in profiting from the sheep. Okay, so I want to pause there before we keep going. Any questions or comments about either the kind of the situation that Jesus is drawing from, the first century Palestinian situation, or the meaning of verse 1, the reason for the oath statement, why it's directed to the Pharisees, and what Jesus is saying when he says that the shepherd comes to the gate, and anybody who doesn't come to the gate is a robber or a thief. Rachel.
Who would you consider to be thieves and robbers today?
Okay, so Rachel's question is, who would you consider to be thieves and robbers today? So now we're out of the realm of what does the text mean, or what does the text say, and we're entering the text into the meaning of what does the text mean, right? Mm-hmm. So we're just to be clear about that. What I would say is that any unfaithful shepherd, anybody who is more interested in what they can get out of the church, what they can get out of God's people, than for what they can do for God's people, is a thief and a robber. In other words, there's a very beautiful picture. It's my favorite Albrecht Durer picture ever. Durer was I think it was Durer, right? Was the illustrator of the Lutheran Reformation, and he has a very beautiful picture. It's a long rectangle picture. Rachel's going to try to find it. If she can find it, she'll post it. And on one side, it's got Martin Luther, and he's in the pulpit, and he's pointing. And on the other side is the church at Wittenberg, and actually, Durer used the faces of real members of the church of Wittenberg on the other side. And then right in the middle is Christ crucified. And it's a passage that reminds us that that the purpose of an under shepherd, the purpose of a preacher, is not to draw attention to us as preachers. The goal is not to have people look at us. The goal is to direct people's eyes to Christ. If people remember you did it wrong. If people remember Jesus, you did it right. And so I'd say people who are more interested in getting fame or glory, or people who are more interested in making a lot of money out of the church. Of course, there are a lot of people that make a lot of money by being church leaders. I'd say those are probably the ones that that would be kind of the modern fulfillment. People who view the church as an opportunity to personally benefit, instead of seeing opportunities to serve the way in a way that conforms to the way that Christ served. Okay, so we do have a couple people who are saying that we having some audio issues. So please let us know. We are using a different computer tonight, and if that continues or if that's widespread, let us know. We'll try to figure out what's going on. Any other questions or concerns about verse 1? All right, then let's move on to verses 2 and 3, where Jesus says, "The one who enters by the gate is the shepherd of the sheep. The gatekeeper opens the gate for him, and the sheep listen to his voice. He calls his own sheep by name and leads them out." Okay, so here we have the contrast. So on the one side, we've got the robbers and the thieves. They try to sneak in some clandestine way to try to carry sheep off. But when the shepherd comes to gather his sheep, he goes right to the gate. He goes right to the gatekeeper. And the gatekeeper recognizes and allows the shepherd to have access to his sheep. And of course, and here's where we get the part, this is how the shepherd gains access to his sheep. They hear his voice, and his voice, and they come calling to his voice. I'm just looking through my notes here. There is a little reference, probably a reference here to the doctrine of election. So notice that you are a sheep. What makes you a sheep is that you recognize and hear the voice of your shepherd. It's not that we choose to be the sheep of Jesus. It's that we have been given the ability by God to recognize his voice. It's not something what the sheep can take a lot of credit for. So I listen to my shepherd. That's just what sheep do. They listen to the voice of their shepherd. And then Rachel just posted a note in our comments. If you want to see a picture of the picture that I was referring to, then just follow the link that she posted there. Again, it's my favorite Luther picture painting, and it does just such a beautiful job of speaking to what the pastor's job is all about. It's to point people to Jesus. All right, and then verses 4 and 5, when he, and this would be the shepherd who has entered through the gate the right way, when he has brought out all his own, he goes on ahead of them, and his sheep follow him because they know his voice. But they will never follow a stranger. In fact, they will run away from him, from the stranger, because they do not recognize a stranger's voice. Now, here's where Palestinian shepherding is different than Western shepherding. And that is that in the Western world, especially in the United States, but to a lesser degree in Europe, when animals are shepherded, they're driven. So think about a cattle drive, an old West cattle drive, where the cowboys are driving cattle. They're behind, and they're moving the cattle forward. They're prodding the cattle forward, and a lot of times that's done with the help of dogs, especially sheep dogs. So kind of sheepdog's special job are to watch the edges and make sure that the sheep are heading the direction they're supposed to be going. It's not the way that shepherding worked in Jesus' day, or still works today in Palestine. Shepherd or livestock, but especially sheep, are not driven in Palestine, they're led. Sheep follow in the footsteps of their shepherd. A sheep will never go somewhere the shepherd hasn't already gone. And I just think that's a beautiful picture of discipleship. It's a beautiful picture of how the Bible pictures being a follower of Jesus is all about. It isn't that God drives us to places that we don't really want to go, but he's threatening us. So I guess we got to go there. Instead, he's leading us. He's in front of us, and he is, gently and he is courageously gone ahead of us. And he just simply asks us to follow him where he has gone. It doesn't mean that he's not going to lead us into some scary places. He is. He's told us that our lives are going to be patterned after his, that there's first going to be suffering and then there's going to be a crown. But what he does assure us is that he is never going to take us somewhere where he is not willing to go, where he has not already been gone. And so where he has not already gone. So just kind of a reminder to give thanks for the fact that we have a shepherd that goes ahead of us. Of course, maybe the greatest example of this is the fact that our shepherd has actually gone through the valley of the shadow of death for us. So Jesus knows that we have to face death, and so he too faced death and has come out the other side. And that seems to be at least a valid application of that verse from Psalm 23. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will not be afraid. I will not fear, for you are with me, your rod and your staff, they comfort me. There probably is a reference here. The question is it an illusion, or is it just the fact that they come from similar cultures? But in Numbers 27, when Moses when Moses is about to die and he prays to God, and he asks that God would give his Old Testament people a shepherd that would lead them in and lead them out. That's the same kind of picture that Jesus is using here. So Kelly has a comment, a good reminder for witnessing to, not to scare people into believing in Jesus or remaining in the faith. That's an excellent point. Is that we can't frighten people into being believers. There's a flip side of that coin too. We can't bribe people into becoming believers either. So we can't say to people, well, just be a believer because then you get to go to heaven, right? So something like being a believer is in your own best interest. Now, certainly being a believer is in your own best interest, and one of the great privileges of being a believer is that you get to go to heaven. But ultimately, I'm not a believer only because of what God does for me. Of course, the flip side is, you don't want to say, well, you better be a believer or else, right? And of course, that's true. If you're not a believer, you will spend the rest of eternity in hell. But ultimately, the reason that we're a believer is because of what Jesus has done for us. We're believers not because of what Jesus can give us, but because of who he is and what he's done for us. It's not so much I'll do this now so that what I can get later. It's I do this now because of what I already have, what has already been given me. Discipleship is not something that looks only to the future. In fact, discipleship primarily looks to the past. It looks to what God has already done in Christ, even while it looks expectantly to what has happened in the future. So just like we can't bribe people into the kingdom, and we can't threaten people into the kingdom either. All we do is preach the gospel. We proclaim the good news. We sow the seed, and then we let God worry about the rest. Okay? So we continue to have these sound issues. We're just going to kind of press through it tonight since we're halfway done. I have no idea what could be causing it. And we'll try to evaluate it for next week. So I apologize. Hopefully we can just kind of keep going. One other thing I'll say about these verses is the flip side. So Jesus says that his sheep will listen to his voice. The flip side is that Jesus' sheep will not listen to a stranger's voice. So here, probably the voice of Jesus would be something like the gospel. The message of the gospel, the message that Jesus is the one who's lived, died, and risen again for us. And as believers, if somebody comes to us with a different message, we're not going to hear it. We're not going to listen to it. We're not going to abide by it. because it isn't the message that we have come to know. It's not the voice of our good shepherd that we are hearing. This is a good passage that reminds us that as Christians, we are to be discerning about the messages that we consume, especially messages that have authoritative religious teaching. Not all religious teaching is equal. Some is good and some is not as good, and some is downright bad. And so we are supposed to give attention to the voice of those who are proclaiming God's truths to us, to make sure that we are hearing the voice of our good shepherd. Okay. Rachel has posted another link in case the one that she posted before for the painting was dead. So try the new one from Reformation 2017. All right, and then we'll finish this section with verse 6, which is not the words of Jesus. Okay, so this is the apostles, so this is John's little commentary on the words of Jesus. And he says, Jesus used this figure of speech, but the Pharisees did not understand what he was telling them. Now, so first of all, a couple of things we want to say. This creates a nice little inclusio for this little section. Remember, an inclusio is a section where it begins and ends with the same kind of thought. So most pastors' sermons are inclusios, where the conclusion connects back to the introduction. And we have the beginning, Jesus says, very truly I say to you, Pharisees. And now in verse 6, we have John saying, Jesus said this to the Pharisees. So the reference to the Pharisees in both cases is a reminder that this little section hangs together. But there's more than that going on, because what we have going on in verse 6 is verse 5 made real. So this little parabolic story that if you do not belong to Jesus, you do not hear his voice, is actually being lived out by the Pharisees. They're hearing the words of Jesus, but they're not believing in him because they don't hear his voice. And of course, the reason is because they are not his sheep. They're not a part of his flock. So verse 6 is also, in addition to being an explanatory statement about what is going on in these statements, it's also kind of a reenactment. It's a real life reenactment of what Jesus is saying with this little parable. The Pharisees are the ones who hear the voice of Jesus and do not respond as to their shepherd. Okay, John.
But yet, doesn't verse 5 kind of break down because the sheep may go astray? We also have the parable of the lost sheep, where you go after the one and leave those in the sheep pen, I guess, behind.
Yeah, so John's point is, and very rightly about 5, we haven't talked too much about sheep. Sheep are incredibly stupid creatures. They might be the dimmest mammal that you can find. And so remember, it's a parabolic story. In other words, don't press the details of the parable too hard. So the point that Jesus is making in verses 4 and 5 is that true disciples will listen to the voice of Jesus. And if you don't listen to the voice of Jesus, it shows that you're not a true disciple. He's not commenting on the fact that we'll never listen to the voice of our good shepherd perfectly. We'll always need to continue to be shepherded, right? But nevertheless, the point that he's making is true enough that his sheep are going to follow the voice of their shepherd. We will, as Christians on this side of heaven, we will tend to wander away. And there will be some who will actually follow the voice of a stranger. But following the voice of a stranger ultimately shows that you are not one of Jesus' flock. So a true believer will eventually hear, will eventually believe, will eventually come back to the truth of Jesus' word. Okay, we're continuing to have trouble with the links on the the picture. I shouldn't have brought it up. Um, for just a, I want to talk just a little bit about the for further thought and discussion question at the bottom of page 4. And it's what makes this shepherd-sheep comparison particularly apt for the relationship that exists between the Lord and his people? Well, we really emphasize part of it, which is the shepherd part. That the fact that the Lord actually goes on ahead of us or something like that. Those kind of thoughts are particularly helpful for describing the loving work of God on our behalf. But the sheep part is actually very good too, and this kind of goes to John's point, is to describe us as spiritual sheep is a good descriptor of what we are spiritually speaking. Sheep are very dim-witted. Sheep will not. They can't go on autopilot. You can't just trust the sheep to do what's in its best interest. Sheep are easily distracted. If they kind of see something out of the corner of their eye that might look like that, I need to check into that, then they'll just kind of go over to it and see what it's all about, regardless of whether leaving the safety of the path is in their best interest. They will go into places, they'll go places where they shouldn't go, like thickets, in search of food, but they'll go to places that will really literally kind of tear them up. The briars and the brambles will tear their skin up. The other interesting thing about sheep, or it's not interesting, but the other thing about sheep is that they're virtually defenseless. They're not fast, so they can't run. They have neither claws nor sharp teeth, and nor are they particularly clever. So a sheep is kind of a sitting target. I mean, they're really, a sheep without its shepherd is in big, big trouble because the predators are faster, smarter, and better equipped than the sheep. And when we think about what we are spiritually, that kind of describes what we are too. We're dim-witted. We go off places where we should never go. We get distracted by things that really don't have our best interest in mind. And compared to the spiritual enemies that we face, especially the devil, we are woefully ill-equipped to do battle. And so the shepherd-sheep relationship, I think, it just, for a whole lot of reasons, is a very beautiful expression of the protector, protectee, provider, providee kind of relationship that exists between the Lord and his people. There are just all kinds of different aspects to it that give explanatory power to the metaphor between God, the relationship that exists between God and his people. And then the other question that I have there is, why do you think that this particular imagery of the Lord being our shepherd and us being the sheep of the Lord is so widely beloved? And it is. I mean, so, arguably Psalm 23 is the most beloved chapter of the Bible. And of course, this question is intentionally stated to be a little squishy. So, everybody might think it's different. But I do think that this idea of having a God out there watching out for you, watching over you, a God who loves you and knows you by name, who calls you by name, a being that recognizes and knows your weaknesses and loves you anyway. Someone who is who's interested in providing for your best interest, regardless of the personal cost to him. The thought of a being that goes with you wherever you go, right? A being who provides and who guides and who leads and who protects. Of course, these are all ideas that appeal in a very primal way to our needs as human beings, our needs as creatures. Remember, it's not wrong to need. God made you. He created you to need him. To need God isn't a weakness. It's how you're made. It's how all of us are made. It's actually a weakness when you think you don't need God. And so to have this beautiful picture of to need God and then to have God meet that need is it appeals to us in a very primal way, in a very basic way that helps remember that there's a hole in every human heart that can only be filled by God. If you can't put anything else in there and that will satisfy. People try. They'll put pleasure, or they'll put drugs, or they'll put liquor, or they'll put their career or success or popularity. Whatever you try to put in that hole, the only thing that can really fill the hole is God. The only thing that can really satisfy the human heart is a relationship with the one true God. And I think this shepherd-sheep imagery is so powerful because perhaps in a way that we're not even fully aware of, it taps into that need, that relationship, that special relationship that exists between God and the human heart, between the Creator and the crown of his creation. Okay, I'd be inclined to kind of say that lesson is done, unless there are any other questions or comments that you want to say about verses 1 to 6. All right, well, if you're typing something, keep typing it. We'll come back. So, but let's move on to the next section now. And I just want to talk a little bit about the relationship between verses 1 to 6 and verses 7 to 18. And this is a much talked about issue. Exactly what is the relationship between verses 1 to 6 and verses 7 to 18? Some people have tried to view verses 7 to 18 as an explanation of verses 1, especially 1 to 5. But I don't think that that's the right way to go. You get into all kinds of issues because the symbols are not static. Jesus is going to use different aspects of the picture that he painted in verses 1 to 5, and he's going to manipulate it. He's going to change different aspects of that picture to make a specific emphasis, and then the picture is going to change a little bit beyond that too. So, for example, in the original parable, we have a watchman at the gate that the shepherd comes to, but then immediately in verse 7, Jesus is the gate. So he's not the shepherd who comes to the gate; he is the gate. And even within that little paragraph, at first he's going to be the gate that stays closed against, and then he's going to be the gate that opens to. So that little picture is going to be manipulated or twisted a little bit to bring out different aspects. And then he's going to go from being the gate for the sheep to being the good shepherd of the sheep. And he's going to go from there being robbers and thieves to there being a hired hand, one of whom is wicked and the other is not. And so I don't think we do ourselves any favor to view 7 to 18 as an explanation of 1 to 5. Instead, I would say that the picture we should think is expansion. He's going to take some ideas that he's thrown out there in this parabolic story in verses 1 to 5, and he's going to build on them with some other different little pictures. Okay. So you'll notice that I called this lesson part 2. I called it the expansion. Originally, it was called the explanation, but I think expansion is better because it's not a whole coherent narrative. It isn't that 7 to 18 is just going to limit itself to the pictures in 1 to 5. It's that it's going to build on the pictures in verses 1 to 5. So Dream makes a comment here. How many hurts could be healed if people would only realize that God in our lives fills that void? So, first of all, as just talk as a pastor, I think 98% of pastoral counseling is helping people see that the reason that they're in my office, the reason that they're hurting is because they're trying to fill the hole with something that isn't God. And then I'll take off my pastor hat and I'll just put on my Christian hat and say, well, how much of my own pain would go away if I would just, take my own advice, right? If I would just learn the lesson myself. is that I am very often that sheep that, hey, that looks cool, I'll wander over there. And I get ripped up by the bristles and the brambles of life. Or, I'm the one that hears a voice that I know isn't the voice of my good shepherd. And well, how dangerous can it be to follow that for a while? And so, I just think how true that is, right? How much pain and hardship and heartache goes that we put ourselves through because we act like dim-witted sheep. Because we try to fill the God-sized hole with things that just can't fill it. People can't fill that hole. I don't care how good the person is. Only God can fill that hole. Your spouse can't fill it. Your children can't fill it. Your pastor can't fill it. Only God can fill that hole. And so I think you're absolutely right that we do people and we do ourselves a great favor when we let God be God. When we only expect that God can be God and don't expect other people and other things to be God. Only God can meet that need. Only God can satisfy the deepest longings of the human heart and the human condition. Okay, so with that little kind of introduction being said that verses 7 to 18 is an expansion, let's go ahead and look at the first one. So we're looking at chapter 10, verses 7 and 8. Therefore, Jesus said again, very truly I tell you, I am the gate for the sheep. All who have come before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep have not listened to them. So you've got two of the annoying Pastor Arnold markers here, right? You've got the therefore. So whenever you see the therefore, you ask yourself, what is the therefore? And then you've got the repetition of the oath formula. Very truly, I say to you. So I'm about to say something else kind of shocking, something else that's gonna raise your hackles a little bit. Now, I didn't make any comment. I should have made a comment in the notes about the therefore. So it's because the Pharisees don't understand. So remember, the therefore marks what is just on the basis of what has just come. Here's the conclusion. Well, on the basis that what has come just before is the explanatory comment that he's speaking to the Pharisees in this figure of speech, but they didn't understand what he was saying. Therefore, because of their misunderstanding, Jesus says again. So this is a beautiful example of the patience of Jesus. That Jesus does not say, well, you guys are a lost cause. I give up. Okay, this is. That I should take the example of Jesus here. And, when you get somebody that doesn't necessarily get it the first time, that's not a reason to give up. It's a reason to press on, right? Try it a different way. Try to say the same thing in a different way. I remember when we were in college, we had to, as a part of all of our German tests, we had to go to our professor's office and we had to have this little conversation in German with them. And he used to encourage us, if you can't think of the word in the German word that you're trying to think of, then can you think of saying what it is you're trying to say with words that you do know? And so much of when teaching people, especially teenagers, catechism students, is how do you say the same thing in multiple ways? And this is really what Jesus is doing here. He's not going to say anything different in 7 and 8. Than he said in 7 to 18, than he did in 1 to 5. But he's going to say what he said in verses 1 to 5 in completely different ways, in new ways. And the first way of doing that is by using this whole gate or door analogy. Okay, so he goes from being the shepherd at the gate to being the gate. And again, there's this very truly I say to you. So the oath formula reminding us of the kind of shocking way. Now, again, what's shocking about this? Well, what's shocking about it is that, honestly, let's just be honest, the Pharisees would have thought of themselves as the gate. Okay, if you want to get to God, they said, we're more than happy to show you the way. And this is Jesus' way of saying, no. You are not the gate to the Father. I am the gate to the Father. And this is very important to keep in mind so that we can properly understand verse 8. Because verse 8 is difficult. Verse 8 is not easy, and it's especially not easy for 21st century American speakers. Because when you and I hear, all who have come before me are thieves and robbers, maybe you understand this perfectly, but when I read that verse, when I hear before me, I immediately think temporal. I think time. Those who have come temporally before me are thieves and robbers. But that can't be what Jesus means. All who have come before me are thieves and robbers. That would mean that Moses and Abraham and David and John the Baptist were thieves and robbers. And they weren't. Those are all people that Jesus has already spoken of very positively in John's gospel. So when Jesus says all who have come before me are thieves and robbers, don't think time. Think space, spatially, okay? All who are before me. Now, there are two different ways to think about it. There's the way that I wish were probably the right way, and the way that probably is the right way. And the way that I kind of wish was the right way is be something like all who stand before me, in the sense of Jesus is trying to get to his sheep, and then his enemies, are the thieves and the robbers, are in the way. That's one way of understanding it. That's the way that I initially understood it, but I can't find a single commentator who agrees with me, so I'm starting to think that I'm wrong. I think instead the better way of understanding it is that Jesus is the door. His sheep are behind him. And everybody who stands before me are thieves and robbers. So here, there are two different kinds of people in the world. Either you're one of Jesus' sheep and you're behind the door, or you're a thief and a robber and you're before the door. You're in front of the door. And if that's the case, then really what Jesus is saying in verses 7 and 8 is that I am the gate, I am the door that keeps out the thieves and the robbers. I am the door behind which the sheep find safety. I am the guard. I am the gateway that keeps bad people out, that keeps the robbers and the thieves out. So he's not saying anything about Moses and Elijah and Abraham and John the Baptist, because all those people are actually sheep in the sheep pen. What he is saying, though, is that when all who stand before me, all who are before me, all who come up before me, are thieves and robbers, because if you're not with me, you're against me. John.
Those are the Pharisees.
And that's who he's speaking to, right?
Yeah.
So
aren't they the ones that he's referring to?
Yes. So in this sense, this is where you've got continuity between the parable in verses 1 to 5 and the expansion. As you got the repeat of the thought of the robbers and the thieves, right? And just like the robber and the thieves were the Pharisees in the parable, so too they are the robbers and the thieves here. So this is why the oath formula, it also creates that connection. It's linking those two groups of people together. So you're absolutely right that he's speaking primarily about the Pharisees, though you could make the larger application. Anybody who isn't with Jesus is against him. Whoever isn't gathering is scattering. Okay, so when you hear in verse 8, don't think time, think space, not temporally, but spatially. Jesus is the door, and everyone who's standing before the door is a thief or robber. You want to be behind the door, not before the door. Okay? Look, I have 5 more minutes. We're going to keep going. Verses 9 and 10. And now notice the I am statement is repeated. I am the gate. So this is exactly what he said in verse 7, when he said, very truly, I am the gate. But now he repeats it because he's going to twist the imagery a little bit. It's going to be a little different aspect of the metaphor is going to be emphasized. In the first part, in verses 7 and 8, he's the door that keeps out the bad. But here in verse 9, he says, I am the gate. Whoever enters through me will be saved. They will come in and go out and find pasture. So in verse 9, the picture is more that Jesus is the gate through which sheep come and go. And they can either go out into the pasture or they can come into the safety of the sheep pen. Either way is good. It's not that to go into the sheep pen is good and have to go out of the sheep pen is bad. It's that if you go out through Jesus, you get to go out to the pasture. And if you come in through Jesus, you get to come into the safety of the sheep pen. Both are good. But here the picture is more, instead of being a closed door to the enemies, Jesus is the open door or the open gate to his people. He's the one through whom the good things happen. And in this sense, he's very much, the I am the gate statements are very much like the statement Jesus was going to famously make in John 14:6. I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. In other words, by saying I am the gate, Jesus is really emphasizing the exclusivity of himself as the Savior. He's the only way. He's the only gate. He's the only way of going in and out. There is no other way to go in and out. The only other option is to be one of those people who is before him. Okay. So Kelly has the question, why is there not a new paragraph to separate the two gate meanings? I mean, I guess you could do it that way. I think the reason, though, Kelly, is because the paragraph is going to separate the two different metaphors. So we're going to have something very similar go on in the paragraph break in verse 11. So verses 7 to 10 is the gate imagery. And then verses 11 to 13 is the shepherd imagery. Right? So, remember that the paragraph is an editorial choice. So, you could write a letter. I'll tell you who to send the letter to, actually. If you want to write a letter to the NIV committee saying there needs to be a paragraph break between verses 8 and 9 to show the two aspects of the gate analogy. You think you could make a pretty good argument for that. But what I hope to see is that even if you, hopefully because of this discussion, even if you don't have that paragraph, you can see the both parts. There is another paragraph at verse 14, and we'll talk about why that is. Again, the idea kind of it changes again. Now you're right in the sense that just like he repeats "I am the gate," he repeats "I am the good shepherd." And when he repeats "I am the good shepherd," they put a second paragraph, right? At the two different, there's a paragraph marker at the two different "I am the good shepherds." There isn't a paragraph marker at "I am the two gates." So, this might just be more evidence for your letter. If you're going to be consistent whenever Jesus repeats it, then you should do it for the gate, just like you do it for the shepherd. Also, a lot of this paragraph stuff has more to do with length, I think, than anything else. This is also, by the way, there is a group of very strange people out there who are against all paragraph breaks in Bibles. So you can find a lot of Bibles that are versified Bibles, where every verse is on a new line. And they get rid of paragraphs altogether. I personally am not a big fan of that particular layout, but there are some people who are very passionate about it. In fact, they refuse to read Bibles that are paragraph Bibles. Verse 10 is so misunderstood that I don't want to cram it into 40 seconds. Verse 10 needs its own little discussion. So we're going to end tonight there. We'll pick up next week by just doing a real brief review of the parable and the first section. And then we'll talk at length about what some people say verse 10 means and what it doesn't mean. And then we'll talk about what verse 10 does mean and how we should rightly understand verse 10. If you really can't wait, just read the notes. We'll pick up there. Actually, I should say we're actually going to pick up with that in 2 weeks, because next week we're going to do something special. Everybody who's out there watching should know that I'm an equally opportunity bad person. That not only did I miss the live streaming Sunday night Bible study, I also missed, I was teaching a Sunday morning class here at Bethlehem, and I didn't teach that either because I was sick. And I've had requests for some people to who really want to see that class because of the complexity of the preaching schedule here at Bethlehem when you have multiple pastors. Just moving Bible class a week is not something you can very easily do. So the suggestion was made that we use our Sunday night time to do that Bible class. So next week, we're going to take a little break from John. And next week, we're going to do a study of why Lutherans have traditionally called the Pope the Antichrist. So it'll be a study of 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 as a part of our modern Catholicism class that we've been doing here at Bethlehem. You are more than welcome to join us. Just know that we won't be talking about John. We'll be talking about 2 Thessalonians 2. And then we also might have some people joining us who don't normally join us for John because they want to hear about the Antichrist 2 Thessalonians 2 part. So we'll pick up here with John chapter 10 in 2 weeks. If you're just really only interested in John and you get next week off, join us in 2 weeks. But next week we'll be talking about the Pope as the Antichrist as a part of that Sunday morning class here at Bethlehem. Let's close with the blessing. May the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, the love of God the Father, and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be and abide with us always. Amen. God's blessings, and hope to see you soon.